Lord Russell, what is philosophy?
Well, that's a very controversial question. I think no two philosophers will give you the same answer. My own view would be that philosophy consists of speculations about matters where exact knowledge is not yet possible. But that will only be my answer, not anybody else's.
What's the difference between philosophy and science?
Well, roughly you'd say science is what we know and philosophy is what we don't know. That's a simple definition. And for that reason, Christians are perpetually passing over from philosophy into science as knowledge advances.
When something is established and discovered, it ceases to be philosophy and becomes science.
Yes. And all sorts of questions that used to be labeled philosophy are no longer so labeled.
What good is philosophy?
I think philosophy has two uses, really. One of them is to keep alive speculation about things that are not yet amenable to scientific knowledge. After all, scientific knowledge covers a very small part of the things that interest mankind and ought to interest them. There are a great many things of immense interest about which science, at present at any rate, has nothing to say. And I don't want people's imaginations to be limited and enclosed within what can be now known. And I think to enlarge your imaginative purview of the world into the hypothetical realm is one of the uses of philosophy. But there's another use which I think is equally important, which is to show that there are things we thought we knew and don't know. On the one hand, to keep us thinking about things that we may come to know, and on the other hand, to keep us modestly aware of how much that seemed like knowledge isn't knowledge.
Could you give some illustrations of the sort of subjects which have been speculated about and then produce some material result later?
Yes, it's quite easy to do so, especially from Greek philosophy. The Greeks invented a whole lot of hypotheses which turned out valuable later, but which in their day couldn't be tested. Take, for example, the atomic hypothesis. Democritus invented the atomic hypothesis that matter consists of little atoms. And after about 2,000 years, rather more than that, it turned out that this was the right scientific view. But in his day, it was merely a suggestion.
But didn't Plato think that Democritus's theory about atoms was a lot of nonsense?
Plato was horrified by him, said all his books ought to be burnt, because Plato didn't like science. He liked mathematics, but he didn't like anything else that was scientific.
Now, in this way, philosophy, in a sense, becomes a kind of servant of science.
Well, that's part of it. But, of course, it isn't only a servant of science, because there are a number of things that science can't deal with. All questions of values, for example. Science won't tell you what is good and what is bad. Tell you what is good or bad as an end, and not just as a means.
But what change has there been over the years in the attitude of philosophers and the public to philosophy, would you say?
Well, that depends upon the school of philosophy that you're thinking of. In Plato and in Aristotle, both of them, the main thing was an attempt to understand the world. And that, I should say personally, is what philosophy ought to be doing. But then you come on to the Stoics, and their emphasis was mainly on morality. That you ought to be stoical, you ought to endure misfortunes patiently. And that came to be the popular use of a philosopher.
Would you say that Marx was a philosopher?
Well, he was certainly in a sense a philosopher. But now there you have an important division among philosophers. There are some philosophers who exist to uphold the status quo, and others who exist to upset it, and Marx, of course, belongs to the second lot. For my part, I should reject both those as being not the true business of a philosopher. And I should say the business of a philosopher is not to change the world, but to understand it, which is the exact opposite of what Marx said.
What kind of a philosopher would you say you are?
Well, the only label I've of is logical atomist, but very keen on the label. I've rather avoided labels.
What does that mean, a logical atomist?
It means, in my mind, that the way to get at the nature of any subject matter you're looking at is analysis, and that you can analyze until you get to things that can't be analyzed any further. And those would be logical atoms. I call them logical atoms because they're not little bits of matter. They're the, so to speak, ideas out of which a thing is built up.
What is the main trend of philosophy today?
Well, one would have to distinguish there between English-speaking countries and continental European countries. The trends are much more separate than they used to be, very much more. In English-speaking countries, and especially in England, there is a new philosophy which has arisen, I think, through the desire to find a separate field for philosophy. In what I was saying a moment ago, it would appear that philosophy is merely incomplete science, and there are people who don't like that view. They want to have science have a sphere, philosophy have a sphere to itself. That has led them into what you may call linguistic philosophy, that the important thing for the philosopher is not to answer questions, but to get the meaning of the questions quite clear. I can't myself agree to that view, but I could give an illustration. I was once bicycling to Winchester, and I lost my way, and I went to a village shop, and I said, can you tell me the shortest way to Winchester? And the man I asked called to a man in a back region whom I couldn't see. Gentleman wants to know the shortest way to Winchester. And the voice came back, Winchester? Aye. Way to Winchester? Aye. Shortest way? Aye. Don't know. And so I had to go on without getting an answer. Well, that is what Oxford philosophy thinks one should do.
We get the question right, never mind about the answer.
Yes, it's somebody else's business to give the answer.
How does this differ from the continental approach?
The continental approach is, well, it's more full-blooded. I don't agree with it anymore, but in a sense it's much more full-blooded and much more like philosophies of earlier times. There are various kinds. There's the philosophy that comes from Kierkegaard, existentialism. And then there are philosophies designed to provide apologetics for traditional religion. There are various things of that sort. I don't think myself that there's anything very important in all that.
What practical use is your sort of philosophy to a man who wants to know how to conduct himself?
A great many people write to me saying they are now completely puzzled as to how they ought to conduct themselves, because they've ceased to accept the traditional signposts to right action and don't know what others to adopt. And I think that the sort of philosophy I believe in is useful in this way, that it enables people to act with vigor when they're not absolutely certain that that is the right action. I think nobody should be certain of anything. If you're certain, you're certainly wrong, because nothing deserves certainty. And so one ought always to hold all one's beliefs with a certain element of doubt, and one ought to be able to act vigorously in spite of the doubt. After all, this is what a general does when he's planning a battle. He doesn't quite know what the enemy will do, but if he's a good general, he guesses right. If he's a bad general, he guesses wrong. But one has, in practical life, to act upon probabilities. And what I should look to philosophy to do to encourage people to act with vigor without complete certainty.
Yes, but now, how about this business, though, of making people so uncertain about things they'd sort of believed and had faith in? Doesn't that rather disturb them?
Well, it does for a time, of course. And I think a certain amount of disturbance is an essential part of mental training. But if they have any knowledge of science, they get a ballast which enables them to avoid being completely upset by the doubts that they ought to feel.
What do you think is the future of philosophy?
I don't think philosophy can in the future have anything like the importance that it had either to the Greeks or in the Middle Ages. I think the rise of science inevitably diminishes the importance of philosophy.
Well, would you summarize the value of philosophy?
First, because, as I say, it keeps you realizing that there are very big and very important questions that science, at any rate at present, can't deal with, and that a scientific attitude by itself is not adequate. And the second thing it does is to make people a little more modest intellectually and aware that a great many things which have been thought certain turned out to be untrue, and that there's no shortcut to knowledge, and that the understanding of the world, which to my mind is the underlying purpose that every philosopher should have, that is a very long and difficult business about which we ought not to be dogmatic.
Thank you, Lord Russell.
Lord Russell, speaking as of today, can you see the influence of any one philosopher more than any other one?
Well, I suppose in recent years the most important influence has been Marx. If you can dignify him with the name of philosopher, I should hardly like to dignify him so myself, but I suppose he must count in the list, and he certainly has had more influence than anybody else.
For those of us who reject Marx, can you offer any positive philosophy to help us toward a more hopeful future?
Well, as to that, you see, I think one of the troubles of the world has been the habit of dogmatically believing something or other. And I think all these matters are full of doubt, and the rational man will not be too sure that he's right. I think that we ought always to entertain our opinions with some measure of doubt. I shouldn't wish people dogmatically to believe any philosophy, not even mine. Not even mine. No, I think we should accept our philosophies with a measure of doubt. What I do think is this, that if a philosophy is to bring happiness, it should be inspired by kindly feeling. Now, Marx is not inspired by kindly feeling. Marx pretended that he wanted the happiness of the proletariat. What he really wanted was the unhappiness of the bourgeois. And it was because of that negative element, because of that hate element, that his philosophy produced disaster. A philosophy which is to do good must be one inspired by kindly feeling and not by unkindly feeling.
Are you not a Christian?
Because I see no evidence whatever for any of the Christian dogmas. I've examined all the stock arguments in favor of the existence of God, and none of them seem to me to be logically valid.
Do you think there's a practical reason for having a religious belief for many people?
Well, there can't be a practical reason for believing what isn't true. That's quite, at least I rule it out as impossible. Either the thing is true or it isn't. If it is true, you should believe it, and if it isn't, you shouldn't. And if you can't find out whether it's true or whether it isn't, you should suspend judgment. But you can't, it seems to me, a fundamental dishonesty and a fundamental treachery to intellectual integrity to hold a belief because you think it's useful and not because you think it's true.
Well, I was thinking of those people who find that some kind of religious code helps them to live their lives. It gives them a very strict set of rules, the rights and the wrongs.
Yes, but you know, those rules are generally quite mistaken. A great many of them do more harm than good. And they would probably be able to find a rational morality that they could live by if they dropped this irrational, traditional, taboo morality that comes down from savage ages.
But are we, perhaps the ordinary person, perhaps isn't strong enough to find this own personal ethic? They have to have something imposed upon them from outside.
Oh, I don't think that's true. And what is imposed on you from outside is of no value whatever. Doesn't count.
Well, you were brought up, of course, as a Christian. When did you first decide that you did not want to remain a believer in the Christian ethic?
I never decided that I didn't want to remain a believer. I decided between the ages of 15 and 18, I spent almost all my spare time thinking about Christian dogmas and trying to find out whether there was any reason to believe them. And by the time I was 18, I discarded the last of them.
Do you think that that gave you an extra strength in your life?
Oh, I don't know. No, I shouldn't have said so. Neither extra strength nor the opposite. I mean, I was just engaged in the pursuit of knowledge.
As you approach the end of life, do you have any fear of some kind of afterlife, or do you feel that that is just an impossibility?
No, I think that's nonsense.
There is no afterlife?
None whatever.
Do you have any fear of something that is common amongst atheists and agnostics who have been atheists or agnostics all their lives, who are converted just before they die to a form of religion?
Well, you know, it doesn't happen nearly as often as religious people think it does. Because religious people, most of them, think that it's a virtuous act to tell lies about the deathbeds of agnostics and such. As a matter of fact, it doesn't happen very often.
Of the sort of conventional self-indulgences or vices like drink and tobacco and so on, which is your favorite one?
Oh, tobacco. I smoke a pipe all day long except when I'm eating or sleeping.
Hasn't that shortened your life?
Well, they used to say it would when I first took to it, but I took to it some 70 years ago, so it doesn't seem to have had a very great effect so far. In fact, you know, on one occasion it saved my life. I was in an airplane, and the man was getting a seat for me, and I said, get me a seat in the smoking part, so if I can't smoke I should die. And sure enough, there was an accident, a bad accident, and all the people in the non-smoking part of the plane were drowned. And the people in the smoking part jumped into the Norwegian fjord where we landed and were saved. So that I owe my life to smoking.
Did you have...
But I do like clarity and exact thinking, and I believe that very important to mankind. Because when you allow yourself to think inexactly, your prejudices, your bias, your self-interest comes in ways you don't notice. And you do bad things without knowing that you're doing them. Self-deception is very easy. So that I do think clear thinking immensely important. But I don't think philosophy in the old-fashioned sense is quite the thing the world needs nowadays. I think the needs of the world are different from that.
One last question. Suppose, Lord Russell, this film were to be looked at by our descendants, like a Dead Sea Scroll in 1,000 years' time. What would you think it's worth telling that generation about the life you've lived and the lessons you've learned from it?
I should like to say two things. One intellectual and one moral. The intellectual thing I should want to say to them is this. When you are studying any matter or considering any philosophy, ask yourself only what are the facts and what is the truth that the facts bear out. Never let yourself be diverted either by what you would wish to believe or
by what you think would have beneficent social effects if it were believed, but look only and solely at what are the facts. That is the intellectual thing that I should wish to say. The moral thing I should wish to say to them is very simple. I should say, love is wise, hatred is foolish. In this world, which is getting more and more closely interconnected, we have to learn to tolerate each other. We have to learn to put up with the fact that some people say things that we don't like. We can only live together in that way. And if we are to live together and not die together, we must learn a kind of charity and a kind of tolerance, which is absolutely vital to the continuation of human life on this planet.